So between 1998 and 2000, there were up to 100,000 people who died in just bloody trench warfare.
Oh, yeah, it's a staggering number.
Right. I mean, 100,000 lives lost in these dusty ditches.
Yeah.
And the linchpin of this entire devastating conflict was a town.
Yeah.
But not a strategic port or a massive oil field or a capital city. It was a town that either doesn't really exist or is located somewhere else entirely or goes by a completely different name.
I mean, it sounds like the premise for a surreal, dark comedy, but it is a very grim reality.
Yeah.
When human lives are on the line,
Yeah.
we expect the reasons to be undeniably tangible.
Right, of course.
But step into the world of colonial cartography and that logic it totally evaporates.
And that evaporation of logic is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
We are looking at the bizarre, deeply rooted, and utterly tragic conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea.
Yeah, it's a heavy one.
It is. We're going to trace the anatomy of this border from the literal dawn of humanity up to modern proxy wars. And we'll figure out how geography and a few poorly translated words can be weaponized.
Right. And our foundation for this journey is a piece by Frank Jacobs. It was published in the New York Times back in March 2012.
Right.
It's titled War Over a One-Horse Town. And it comes complete with these incredibly dense, fascinating historical footnotes.
Yeah, the footnotes are amazing. And I want to set a really clear mission statement here at the top, because both of these nations have fiercely protective national narratives.
Right, heavily protective. And they completely contradict each other.
Exactly. So our goal today is purely to look at the anatomy of the border itself.
Right.
How the map was drawn and the claims presented in this history as laid out in the article. We are absolutely not taking sides or endorsing either nation's viewpoint or litigating who is morally right.
No, definitely not. What's fascinating here is that while countries are normally defined by the lines that divide them, this story shows what happens when those lines are drawn with a mix of imperial carelessness and just intense local pride.
Absolutely. We are just looking at the mechanics of the map, because to understand a border dispute happening in the modern era, you'd assume we need to look back a century or two.
Sure, yeah.
But to figure out who claims this land first, we aren't going back 100 years.
No.
We have to go back 125,000 years.
Which completely shifts the scale of what a historical claim even means.
It's mind-boggling, yeah.
I mean, 125 millennia ago, the southern end of the strait between Africa and Arabia was much narrower than it is today.
Okay.
And that narrow geographic choke point likely served as the springboard for one of early humanity's greatest migratory leaps.
Wow.
It was the out-of-Africa exodus.
Right, the big one.
Yeah, our ancient ancestors crossed the Red Sea into the Sinai, and from there they went on to populate the rest of Eurasia.
Wait, so how do we actually know that's the route they took? I mean, 125,000 years is a long time.
It is. And there are a few theories, but a major one relies on mitochondrial DNA.
Okay.
Without getting too deep into the genetics, mitochondrial DNA is passed down from mothers, and it mutates at a relatively predictable rate.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so by tracking those tiny genetic markers across global populations today, scientists can literally trace the map backward.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that data points to a coastal migration from East Africa across that narrow strait to Arabia and all the way to India.
So this specific region between Ethiopia and Eritrea is essentially the literal cradle of the global human diaspora.
Exactly. It's almost a prefiguration of the biblical trek into the Promised Land.
Yeah, right.
But here is where ancient science collides with modern nationalism.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, if you go into East African internet chat rooms today, you will literally see people fighting over the nationality of those very first migrating humans.
Right, really?
Oh, yeah. They argue over whether those ancient Red Sea pedestrians originated in what is now modern-day Eritrea or what is now modern-day Ethiopia.
That is just mind-boggling. It's like two siblings brawling over who gets to claim the roots of the family tree, except the tree is the entire human race.
Yeah, it's exactly like that.
But why does that matter to a modern government? I mean, surely nobody's bringing up cavemen in a diplomatic treaty.
They might not put it in a treaty, no. But in a region steeped in this kind of deep history pedigree is the ultimate source of legitimacy.
Oh, I see.
I mean, even Balkan grudges, which we think of as ancient, are really only centuries old.
Right.
These East African grudges draw on millennia. Take the recorded history, for example. Around 2500 BC, The Egyptians knew this area as Punt.
Punt, yeah.
Yeah, it was a major source of precious materials and slaves for the pharaohs. And most definitions of ancient Punt include modern Eritrea.
Oh, wow. And even the name Eritrea has ancient roots, right?
It does, yeah.
It comes from the Greek word for Erythra, the last meaning Red Sea.
Wow. Yes, exactly, tying into an ancient custom of associating directions with colors. So you have a place with a Greek name, an Egyptian history, and a prehistoric claim to humanity's origin.
That is a lot of history.
It is. And that pedigree is weaponized today because legitimacy is tied to age. Ethiopia frequently uses Eritrea's relative newness as an independent state as an inculpatory argument.
Meaning they use Eritrea's youth to prove it's an artificial country.
Right.
So Ethiopia's argument is basically you are just a European imperialist creation. You were snatched from the historically united Ethiopian empire by Italy.
That is the core of their narrative, yes. Eritrea is framed as a colonial fiction.
But wait, if Ethiopia is claiming Eritrea is an artificial imperial creation, couldn't Eritrea just turn around and say, well, Ethiopia is doing the exact same thing to us?
That is precisely the Eritrean rebuttal.
Ah, okay.
From their perspective, Ethiopia never truly owned Eritrea to begin with. The Eritrean view is that Ethiopia simply watched the Italian colonial model and then replicated it, imposing their own imperial rule over the region later on.
Okay, so this all hinges on Italy.
Yes.
How did an Italian colonial experiment permanently fracture an ancient empire?
Well, it comes down to one of the most consequential and honestly devastating translation errors in modern history.
Oh, wow, a translation error.
Yeah, we have to look at the 1889 Treaty of Wuchale, which Italy imposed on Ethiopia.
This is where the mechanics of colonial treaties get incredibly shady. There were two versions of this treaty, right?
Exactly.
One in Amharic, which is Ethiopia's lingua franca, and one in Italian. And Article 17 had a massive discrepancy.
A discrepancy that completely altered the destiny of the Horn of Africa. The Amharic version stated that Italy could act as an intermediary for Ethiopia to the outside world.
Okay.
It was a suggestion, an option for diplomatic help.
But the Italian version of that exact same article swapped a single concept.
Yeah.
It said Ethiopia must use Italian mediation.
Yes, the difference between can and must. The Italian text effectively stripped Ethiopia of its sovereignty, forcing them to cede total control over their foreign relations to Rome.
Wait, an entire war and a permanent national fracture started over the difference between the words can and must in a translation.
It did.
It's like downloading an app and thinking you clicked, I agree to share your location data, but the Italian version of the terms of service actually said, I agree to give you the deed to my house.
That's a perfect way to put it, yeah.
How does a treaty even get signed with that big of an error?
Whether it was deliberate deception by Italian diplomats or just catastrophic incompetence by the translators, the result was the same. When a proud ancient empire realizes it has been tricked into signing away its independence, the reaction is entirely predictable.
They went to war.
They went to war.
The first Italo-Ethiopian War kicked off in 1895, and Ethiopia actually won.
They did it.
Which is a massive historical milestone that doesn't get talked about enough. At that time, it was the only victory of a native African state over a modern European power.
It was a humiliating defeat for Italy.
Yeah.
To end the conflict, they signed the 1896 Treaty of Addis Ababa. This secured Ethiopia's independence, which is a monumental achievement for the empire.
Yeah. Huge.
But in exchange, it confirmed the loss of the coastal territory to Italy. And that territory became Eritrea.
Okay, so they fight a bloody war over a misunderstood treaty. You would assume they were incredibly careful about drawing the new border to prevent it from happening again.
You would assume so, yes. But instead, they created a cartographic nightmare.
Of course they did.
The new border between Eritrea and Ethiopia was delimitated, meaning it was formally defined in the text of the new treaty.
Okay.
And it was delineated, meaning diplomats drew lines on maps back in Europe several times into the early 20th century.
But it was never demarcated.
Never even tentatively demarcated.
Let's break those terms down because that distinction is the trap that catches them a century later.
Yeah, it is.
So delimitated is the legal text. Delineated is the drawing on a piece of paper. Demarcated means physically walking the land and hammering posts into the dirt right.
Precisely. Demarcation is building the fence. It's the physical realization of the legal agreement.
You can draw a straight line on a map in Rome. But if that line cuts straight through a mountain range or a river or an ancestral village, you don't know that until you demarcate it.
And they never did.
They never did. It remained a theoretical line, invisible to the people actually living on the ground.
Why would they skip that step? I mean, if you share a vague border with a hostile colonial power, leaving it invisible seems incredibly dangerous.
Well, it didn't matter at the time because history simply steamrolled over the border.
Oh, right.
Italy eventually got its way. In the Second Italo-Ethiopian War in the 1930s, Mussolini defeated Emperor Haile Selassie.
Right. World War II era.
Yeah, he annexed Ethiopia entirely into what they called Africa Orientale, Italiana, joining it with Eritrea and Somalia. So the border vanished because Italy owned both sides of it.
Until World War II, when Italy loses everything.
Exactly.
The UN steps in after the war, and they mandate a federation between Ethiopia and Eritrea.
But a federation implies a level of autonomy which Ethiopia wasn't really interested in maintaining. By 1962, Ethiopia outright annexed Eritrea, downgrading it to its 14th province.
Wow.
They completely absorbed it.
So, once again, the physical border isn't an issue because the Ethiopian government has just erased it.
Right.
But the way they went about erasing it is what guarantees the next war. Because they didn't just annex the land, they tried to assimilate the culture. Ethiopia forced the use of Amharic in Eritrean schools.
And this is a crucial mechanism of control to understand.
Yeah.
Educational language policy sounds bureaucratic.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like the spark of a revolution.
Right. On paper, it just looks like standardizing a curriculum. How does teaching a language start a war?
Because language is the operating system of a culture.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
When an occupying force bans your language in schools, they are telling your children that their identity is invalid. It is viewed as a blatant, intimate act of colonialism. If we connect this to the bigger picture, look at South Africa in 1976. The white minority government introduced Afrikaans as a compulsory language for black students.
Oh, I remember reading about that.
Yeah, that single policy triggered massive, large-scale riots. Those riots fanned the flames of a protest movement that ultimately helped dismantle apartheid in the 1990s.
So what does this all mean? It means Ethiopia absorbed Eritrea to gain territory, but by forcing their culture, they basically guaranteed Eritrea would fight to break away.
And that fight lasted 30 years. It was a bitter, grueling war for independence. Finally, in 1991, Eritrean rebels fighting alongside Ethiopian rebels who wanted to overthrow their own military junta in Addis Ababa succeeded.
Okay.
By 1993, Eritrea won its independence through a UN-supervised referendum.
Okay. 1993. Eritrea is finally a sovereign nation. After 40 years of struggle, the war is over. You'd think everyone could finally just stay on their side of the line.
But remember that vague, poorly drawn colonial line from the 1890s?
The invisible one?
The one that was drawn on paper, but never demarcated in the dirt. Suddenly you have an armed, highly militarized, independent, and very unfriendly Eritrea right next door.
Oh, man.
That invisible line is about to become the deadliest place on earth.
So the tension simmers for a few years, and then in May 1998, the fuse detonates. Ethiopian troops kill some Eritrean soldiers near the border. Eritrea retaliates by occupying a previously Ethiopian-held town called Badme.
And this is where Eritrea makes a catastrophic miscalculation.
Okay.
If they thought they could just exploit those vague Italian-era maps to grab a border town and negotiate again, they completely ignored the domestic politics of Ethiopia's leadership.
Who was leading Ethiopia at the time?
The prime minister was Meles Zenawi. He, along with most of the Ethiopian leadership, hailed from Tigray. And Tigray was the exact province affected by the Eritrean occupation of Badme. Eritrea essentially invaded the political homeland of the Ethiopian ruling class.
That makes it intensely personal.
Very.
And it was already personal, wasn't it? The leaders knew each other.
Very well. Zenawi is a Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. And the Eritrean president, Isaias Afewerki's Eritrean People's Liberation Front, had fought side by side to topple the regime in Addis Ababa back in 1991.
Wow.
They were brothers in arms who fell out immediately after independence. The entanglement was so deep that in 2010, Zenawi actually had to publicly deny rumors that he and Afewerki were cousins.
Wait, really?
Yeah, they had to officially say, no, we are not cousins.
That is wild. A literal family feud playing out with national armies. So Eritrea takes Badme, and Ethiopia responds with what is described as total war. They launch simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts. They bomb the airport in Eritrea's capital, Asmara. Eritrea launches retaliatory air raids.
And then the tactical reality of the war degrades in a terrifying way. Right. The modern air phase burns out, and the conflict regresses from the tactics of World War II entirely backward to the tactics of World War I.
Wait, how do two modern nations in 1998 regress to 1914 warfare? Why trenches?
Because of the geography and the economics. Neither side had the overwhelming mechanized superiority needed to sweep across the terrain quickly.
I see.
When you are fighting over a barren, relatively flat borderland and your supply lines are stretched, the army stall, they dig in to hold the line. It becomes a static war of attrition. You have human wave attacks against fortified positions.
Thousands upon thousands of people dying in dusty ditches.
Yes.
The casualties are astronomical, not just at Badme, but at other disputed areas to the east, places like Sornonzel-Mbessa and Bure, between 70,000 and 100,000 lives lost in just 2 years.
A staggering human cost. And by May 2000, Ethiopia effectively wins. They occupy all the disputed areas, plus about 20% of uncontested Eritrean territory. Eritrea is forced to admit defeat.
But this is the moment where the geopolitical logic completely falls apart for me.
Oh, yeah.
Ethiopia wins. They have the upper hand. Now remember that when Eritrea gained independence in 1993, they took the entire coastline. Ethiopia became totally landlocked.
Right.
So logically, if you just won a massive war and occupied your neighbor, your primary demand at the peace table would be access to a seaport.
It would be the most rational, strategic move for a landlocked nation's economy.
But they don't even ask for it. They didn't even request port access. All they demanded was Badme.
Which brings us to the surreal, almost mythical status of this town.
Let's talk about the reality of Badme. With 100,000 people dead, you would assume Badme sits on a massive gold mine or controls a vital water source or a strategic mountain pass.
It has absolutely zero strategic value.
None.
None. Scholars refer to the plain around the town as a relatively useless borderland. It's just an empty space between two boundary rivers, the Mareb to the north and the Seta to the south.
So why die for it?
Because it became deeply symbolic. It transformed into an East African Kosovo Polje.
Okay, what is the mechanics of that comparison? How does Kosovo Polje work as a symbol?
Well, Kosovo Polje, the Blackbird Field near Pristina, is the site of a battle in 1389 where the Ottomans won a Pyrrhic victory over the Serbs.
Okay, 1389, that's going way back.
Exactly, and that specific patch of dirt imprinted itself onto the Serbian psyche. It became a mythological symbol of grievance and nationalism that was instrumental in fueling the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s.
Oh.
The actual strategic value of the field didn't matter. It was the idea of the field. Badme took on that exact same untouchable symbolism for Ethiopia and Eritrea.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
The symbol is a complete illusion, because the town they were fighting over is a cartographic ghost. The actual town in that area is called Yurga.
And Yurga is located clearly to the south of the disputed border, solidly on the Ethiopian side.
Yes. Yurga was founded in the 1950s by an Ethiopian man, and he named the village after his favorite horse, Abey Yurga. They fought a war over a literal one-horse town.
Yeah, the locals eventually just started referring to the settlement as Badme. But the word Badme also refers to the wider, empty plain that the town sits on.
And it's that wider, useless plain that the invisible border cuts through.
Right.
In the original Italian and Ethiopian documents from the 1800s, this specific area doesn't even have a name because nobody lived there. It was completely uninhabited.
The cartography is so chaotic that some maps show another settlement just north of the border, about 10 miles away from Yurga, that it's also called Badme.
You're kidding.
No. Scholars half-jokingly suggested resolving the war by just having two towns called Badme, or officially renaming Yurga back to its original name to clear up the paperwork.
That would be too easy, I guess. But they didn't do that. Instead, we get an international arbitration in 2002 that results in a staggering failure of diplomacy.
Yeah, the EEBC.
Right, the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission. They released their final report to settle the border once and for all.
A highly anticipated ruling meant to justify a war that killed 100,000 people. And in that massive document, they mentioned Badme exactly once by name.
Once. And they don't even put it on the map.
No, they didn't put it on the map.
How does an international commission justify doing that? How do you draw a border without looking at the reality on the ground?
Because international arbitration operates on rigid legalism. They aren't looking at who lives there now. They are looking at the foundational treaties.
The old ones.
Right. They blindly reprised a straight line that had been unilaterally proposed by the Italians decades earlier. By strictly applying that old colonial math, they sliced off most of the disputed Badme Triangle and legally awarded it to Eritrea.
So Ethiopia sacrifices tens of thousands of its citizens to take Badme back. They win the war, and then an international commission just hands the land over to Eritrea anyway.
Yes. Ethiopia immediately objected, but the ruling was final. It created a fate demi-accomplished, a partially accomplished fact.
Okay.
Legally, internationally, the border was decided. But practically, Ethiopia still physically occupies the Badme area, heavily militarized, refusing to leave.
Which leaves both nations paralyzed. They are trapped in a permanent, unresolved stalemate over a ghost town.
Yeah.
If they aren't fighting a full-scale trench war anymore, how do the governments survive this constant state of high alert?
By locking down their own populations and fighting everywhere else. By 2012, there was a profound, grim symmetry between the two nations. Both became fiercely authoritarian to maintain control during this endless standoff.
Let's look at the mechanics of that control. In Eritrea, they were scheduled to hold national elections in 2001, but the government indefinitely shelved them using the unresolved border conflict as the ultimate excuse. National security trumped democracy.
The domestic suppression is absolute. Eritrea earned the chilling distinction of scoring worse than North Korea on the Press Freedom Index.
Wait, worse than North Korea?
Yes. In 2010, Reporters Without Borders ranked them 178th out of 178 countries. Dead last globally.
You literally cannot get worse than North Korea. But Ethiopia's democratic process wasn't functioning much better. In their 2010 parliamentary elections, the ruling party won 545 out of 547 seats.
Yeah.
It's an illusion of choice. So you have two deeply entrenched regimes, and because a direct war over the border is too costly, they export their violence.
They turn to proxy wars. Somalia becomes the tragic chessboard. Eritrea begins backing the Islamist Shabab militias inside Somalia, while Ethiopia throws its military weight behind the opposing transitional federal government in Mogadishu.
Fighting their war with someone else's blood on someone else's soil. But the tension is always bleeding back to their own border, which brings us to March 15th, 2012.
This was the skirmish that proved the border was still a powder keg. Ethiopia sent troops across the line into Eritrea. But they weren't attacking the Eritrean army directly. They attacked 3 bases belonging to a rebel group called the Afar Revolutionary Democratic Unity Front, or ARDUF.
The stated reason was retaliation for ARDUF attacking a tourist group inside Ethiopia. But who are the Afar people, and why are they operating bases across the specific border?
This adds a crucial layer of localized complexity. The Afar are a distinct ethnic group whose ancestral homeland happens to be sliced up by these colonial borders. Their population is distributed across Djibouti, Eritrea, and Ethiopia.
So when diplomats draw a straight line on a map, they're drawing it straight through the living room of the Afar people.
Exactly, and that is why ARDUS exists. Their mission isn't to pick a side between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Their mission is to reject any border demarcation entirely.
Oh, I see.
Because any physical border inherently divides their people.
As an aside, there's a fascinating, almost bureaucratic naming convention to these groups that the author points out.
Oh yes, the taxonomy of East African rebellion.
Yeah.
If you want to be taken seriously as an armed political movement in this region, you cannot call yourself an army or an organization.
Right.
You must be a front.
It is remarkably consistent. You have the Eritrean Liberation Front, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the Islamic Front for the liberation of Oromia,
The Ogaden National Liberation Front, the Oromo Liberation Front, the Somali National Front, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. I mean, the list goes on and on.
It perfectly highlights how militarized and fractured political identity has become. Every single grievance requires a front.
Yeah.
But this 2012 incursion raises a massive question.
Okay.
If Ethiopia just crossed the border to attack a rebel base inside Eritrea, why didn't that trigger a second trench war? We just established they lost 100,000 people over a much smaller incursion in 1998. Why didn't Eritrea retaliate?
Because the underlying math had changed. By 2012, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Ethiopia had solidified itself as an undisputed regional heavyweight. They boasted a population of 80 million people and a rapidly growing, robust economy.
While Eritrea was moving in the opposite direction.
Eritrea had barely 6 million people. And crucially, they were suffering under crippling international sanctions, which were imposed as punishment for their proxy support of those Shabab militias in Somalia. Simply couldn't afford a war.
So the stalemate persists not out of peace, but out of financial and demographic exhaustion. Ethiopia is too rich to care about initiating a war over one-horse town, and Eritrea is too poor to retaliate.
Exactly. The cost of breaking the stalemate is too high for the weaker party, and the benefit is too low for the stronger party. But the hostility remains completely intact, just waiting for the right spark.
It is a terrifying status quo. To pull all of this together, we're looking at a tragedy constructed by layers of history. It starts with the ancient pride of a pedigree stretching back to the origin of humanity.
Right.
That pride is fractured by an Italian translation error over the words can and must in 1889. The fracture is deepened by a forced language policy in schools, and it finally erupts over the absurd cartography of a ghost town named after a horse.
And tens of thousands of human beings paid the ultimate price for those overlapping errors.
They did. And as we close out this deep dive, there is one final detail from the footnotes of this history that provides a genuinely haunting perspective.
Yes. We started by talking about the out-of-Africa hypothesis, how 125,000 years ago, that narrow strait at the Red Sea was the springboard for human expansion. Our ancestors crossed that water to populate the globe. It was a journey of ultimate possibility.
But look at what that exact same geography represents in the modern era. The endless proxy wars, the trench warfare over invisible lines, and the repressive dictatorships built to sustain those wars have turned that ancient route into a desperate escape hatch.
The coastal route remains highly active, but instead of global expansion, it is used for sheer survival. In 2011 alone, more than 100,000 refugees fled across that exact same stretch of water, leaving the Horn of Africa for Yemen.
100,000 people risking the sea.
Which was double the figure from the year before.
The geographical choke point that served as the birthplace of human global migration is now serving as an evacuation route. It leaves you wondering, when we draw lines on a map to violently define exactly where we belong, how often are we just building the cages we eventually have to flee?